The Cold War transformed Europe, and Romania became the scene of one of the era's most brutal dictatorships. At the heart of the regime was Elena Ceaușescu, an ambitious woman who became the second most powerful person in the country. Alongside her husband, Nicolae Ceaușescu, she built an empire of power and oppression. But if the couple's rise was remarkable, their downfall was even more shocking. In this video, you will discover the story of Elena Ceaușescu, the woman who reached the pinnacle of power in Romania, only to meet a brutal end. Stay until the end to find out what was done to her before her execution. You may be surprised. Before we begin, we are working toward a goal of 1 million subscribers. It may sound like a lot, but with your help, we can get there. Subscribe now, leave a like, and become part of the story. Helena was born on January 7, 1916, into a modest family of peasants living in the region historically known as Wallachia, a territory once ruled centuries earlier by Vlad the Impaler. Her childhood was marked by simplicity and the hardships faced by a family that depended on agriculture for its survival. Her father worked as a farm laborer, while her mother cared for the household and instilled in her children the traditional values of rural life. From an early age, Helena was accustomed to the demanding routine of the countryside, where manual labor was an unavoidable part of daily life. The formal education she received was limited, a common reality for peasant children at the time. It was assumed that she would follow in her parents' footsteps, helping in the fields and caring for livestock. Even so, despite having few prospects, she showed an interest in learning. She attended the local school, where she acquired basic reading and writing skills, but her education was cut short. Helena nevertheless had ambition and refused to accept a life of hard labor in the countryside. That restlessness led her, together with her brother, to move to Bucharest in search of better opportunities. In the capital, the young woman encountered a world completely different from the rural environment where she had grown up. Bucharest was a dynamic city, filled with factories, markets, and major construction projects. There, Helena found work as a laboratory assistant, a modest position, but one that allowed her to escape the harsh realities of agricultural labor. Later, she began working in a factory, where she came into contact with workers who discussed politics and social inequality. The industrial and urban environment broadened her worldview and awakened a growing interest in communist ideas, which were beginning to gain strength in the country. The Second World War, which began in 1939, brought even greater instability to Europe, and Romania became a territory contested by different political forces. During this turbulent period, Helena began attending clandestine meetings of the Romanian Communist Party, where she became actively involved in political activism. Her political commitment grew, and she became an increasingly active presence in those circles. It was in this setting that Helena met Nicolae Ceaușescu, a young revolutionary who shared her political convictions and harbored great ambitions within the communist movement. They formed an intense bond from their first meeting and quickly became inseparable. Nicolae was deeply in love with Helena and claimed that after meeting her, he never looked at another woman. His commitment to the communist cause, however, brought many hardships. He was repeatedly imprisoned for his political activism, enduring persecution and harsh prison conditions. Helena stood by him through the most difficult times, strengthening the bond between them. Helena and Nicolae married on December 23, 1947, at a pivotal moment in Romanian history. The Communist Party was consolidating its control over the country, and the monarchy was abolished, paving the way for a socialist regime. As Nicolae rose through the political structure, Helena also gained influence, taking a position at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The role gave her access to influential government figures and allowed her to observe the inner workings of power at close range. As Nicolae climbed the Communist Party hierarchy and reached the position of General Secretary, Helena became his principal ally. She accompanied him on diplomatic trips, attending meetings with world leaders and playing an active role in building Romania's international alliances. her presence was not merely ceremonial. Helena became directly involved in negotiations and political strategy, seeking to consolidate her influence within the government and in public life. Helena's growing power. In 1971, Elena Ceaușescu was sent on an official mission to China, where she came into direct contact with the ideals and practices of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. During the visit, she was particularly fascinated by Jiang Qing, the Chinese leader's wife, who wielded considerable political influence and played a crucial role in the regime. Inspired by her stature and power, Helena developed an even stronger desire to consolidate her own position in Romania, seeking a prominence that went beyond the traditional role of a first lady. Over the years, her husband, Nicolae Ceaușescu, consolidated his position as the country's absolute leader, and Helena followed his rise, becoming a central figure within the government. She held multiple prominent positions, including membership in the Central Commission for Socio-Economic Forecasting and the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Her influence, however, extended far beyond these bureaucratic roles. In practice, she became the second most powerful person in Romania, behind only her husband. Her presence was so prominent that many people, especially women, saw her as a mother figure, a symbol of hope in a country increasingly isolated from the West. Official propaganda consequently exalted her as the mother of the nation, reinforcing her image as a female leader within the regime. Despite her privileged position, Elena Ceaușescu was viewed with suspicion and hostility by many who knew her personally. Her boundless ambition, vanity, and authoritarian personality made her feared within the halls of power. Obsessed with her appearance, particularly her nose, she refused to be photographed in profile and tightly controlled how her public image was presented. Censoring unflattering photographs was one of her many attempts to manipulate public perceptions of her. As the couple consolidated their power, conditions in Romania deteriorated dramatically. The economy collapsed under the regime's disastrous policies, repression of political opponents intensified, and public discontent reached alarming levels. The personality cult surrounding Nicolae and Elena could no longer contain the widespread anger. The crisis culminated in the Romanian Revolution of 1989, which we will examine next. Before we continue, let me know what you think of the content. If you enjoy this kind of video, leave a comment saying that you want more stories. That helps boost engagement and encourages us to keep bringing you more productions filled with fascinating facts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. That way, YouTube will recommend more videos from our channel to you, all right? Now that we've covered those reminders, let's get back to Elena Ceaușescu. The beginning of the revolution. Romania was gripped by growing tension in late 1989, largely because of Nicolae Ceaușescu's oppressive regime, which had become increasingly unpopular among the population. The brutal repression imposed by the government, combined with a devastating economic crisis, had driven the country into despair. Food shortages, frequent blackouts, and the lack of freedom of expression created an untenable environment. While the regime flaunted its power and wealth, the vast majority of Romanians lived in miserable conditions under a government that ignored their basic needs. But the explosive situation reached a critical point on December 16, 1989, when a protest erupted in the city of Timișoara in western Romania. The initial spark was the government's attempt to remove the Hungarian pastor László Tőkész, who had been accused of inciting discontent against the regime through his public criticism. The government claimed that he was inciting hatred and repression was being unleashed on that pretext. But popular outrage quickly went beyond that specific issue, turning into an uprising against the communist regime as a whole. The protest, which began in a small town, soon spread to several other parts of the country, as people took to the streets to express their despair and demand change. The authorities' response was ruthless. While Nicolae Ceaușescu was visiting Iran, his wife, Elena Ceaușescu, directed the repression, ordering the security forces to intervene violently in an attempt to crush the uprising. The police used tear gas and water cannons to disperse the demonstrators, but these methods proved ineffective as their numbers continued to grow. As popular resistance mounted, the crackdown intensified. Police began brutally beating protesters, and reports of arbitrary arrests and torture started to emerge. Yet, instead of suppressing the uprising, the violence had the opposite effect. The number of protests increased, and the demonstrators became more determined. The resistance grew even larger, as citizens united in their struggle against the oppressive regime. As the clashes escalated, the regime sent in the army to try to contain the situation. Tanks began patrolling the city streets, and soldiers prepared to use lethal force against any resistance. The protesters, however, did not back down. In several cities, barricades were erected and vehicles set on fire in an effort to block the advance of the armed forces. Street fighting turned several Romanian cities into genuine war zones, as the population confronted repression with courage and resistance. The scenes of violence and destruction were shocking, but the people's determination was even stronger. As the uprising gathered momentum in the streets, Nicolae Ceaușescu was on a diplomatic visit to Iran, leaving his wife, Elena, in charge of the crackdown. Determined to maintain the regime's grip on power, she declared martial law and imposed a strict curfew in an attempt to intimidate the public and bring the protests under control. But Helena's drastic measures failed to intimidate the population. People defied the orders and continued to challenge the regime. Despite pressure from the authorities, the protesters stood firm in their fight for freedom. Under Helena's leadership, military reinforcements were deployed to several cities, and the violence escalated further. Troops opened fire on protesters, killing dozens. Yet resistance to the regime continued to spread, and the uprising appeared to be becoming irreversible. When Nicolae Ceaușescu returned to Romania on December 21st, the situation was completely out of control. The dictator tried to organize a public speech in Palace Square, Bucharest, intending to reaffirm his authority and calm the population. Instead, the event quickly spiraled out of control. In front of a crowd of more than 100,000 people, Nicolae was booed and interrupted by angry shouts. For the first time in decades, the population was openly defying the dictator. The moment was broadcasting live on state television, and popular anger spread throughout the country. The sounds of gunfire and fireworks echoed across the square, causing panic among those present. The crowd began to disperse en masse, and the Ceaușescus were hurried off the stage and taken back to the building where they had taken refuge. But by then, their fate was already sealed. The Romanian Revolution had taken firm hold, and the people's fury could no longer be contained. The public demanded the regime's immediate downfall and the punishment of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, whom they regarded as chiefly responsible for the country's suffering. In one last desperate attempt to retain power, the government ordered elite troops and anti-terrorism units to mobilize and crush the uprising. Instead, this brutal crackdown led to even more deaths in the streets. Reports indicate that protesters were shot, beaten, stabbed, and even run over by military vehicles as the regime desperately tried to suppress the revolt. Despite numerous opportunities to flee, Nicolae and Elena refused to leave the country. Perhaps they believed they could reverse the situation, or that they still had some support within the armed forces. But that decision would cost them dearly. Elena, as hated as her husband, became one of the uprising's primary targets. The people wanted not only the regime's downfall, but also the punishment of those who had ruled with an iron fist for so long. The end of the regime, end of the dictator's lives. By the morning of December 22, 1989, the Ceaușescu's position had become untenable. The popular uprising was gaining strength, and furious crowds were marching toward Bucharest, demanding an end to the regime. Elena, always alert to danger, realized that resistance was rapidly collapsing. Thousands of protesters filled the streets, defying the ban on public gatherings and making it clear that the capital was no longer under the dictatorial couple's control. With collapse imminent, a desperate escape plan was put into action. Nicolae and Helena hurried to the roof of the building where they had taken refuge and waited for a helicopter to fly them out. But by the time they reached the rooftop, they could already hear the shouts of protesters who had stormed the building and were closing in fast. Chaos erupted. Forced aboard the aircraft with their bodyguards, the Ceaușescus took off amid the panic, visibly stunned. The pilot who witnessed the scene later described the moment with disbelief. There was not enough room. Helena, Nicolae Ceaușescu and I were wedged between the seats and the door. We were supposed to carry only 4 passengers, but we took 6. Yet even their escape by air would not save the couple. Realizing that the regime had already collapsed, the pilot decided not to help them. After dropping them off in Snugov, he refused to continue the flight, warning them that the revolution was in full swing and there was nowhere left to run. Left to fend for themselves, Nicolae and Helena desperately tried to find another means of escape. Within hours, however, they were intercepted by police forces. Captured and taken to a military barracks, they were locked in separate cells, utterly disoriented and hysterical as they awaited the inevitable outcome. Helena had no doubt what fate awaited her. The trial that followed was conducted with extreme haste and had no legal legitimacy. The couple tried to argue their case, but it was clear that the verdict had already been decided. They were accused of genocide and held responsible for the deaths of about 60,000 people, as well as for crimes including ordering attacks on unarmed civilians, devastating the economy, and destroying the country's infrastructure. When the death sentence was announced, Helena protested indignantly, shouting that they were being murdered, not executed. The desire to take part in the firing squad was so strong that the soldiers competed for a place in the execution detail. In the end, however, the decision was made that paratroopers would carry out the task. On December 25, 1989, at 4 p.m., Nicolae and Helena were escorted to a courtyard behind the military barracks where they had been tried. The firing squad was already waiting for them. Resigned to the outcome, Nicolae made one final, defiant statement. "We could have been shot without this farce." Helena, by contrast, reacted with fury. She tried to resist, insulted the soldiers, and struggled with her hands bound. But nothing could change her fate. Within seconds, gunfire echoed across the courtyard, bringing a definitive end to the couple who had ruled Romania with an iron fist for more than 2 decades. The execution happened so quickly that the cameras barely managed to capture the exact moment of their deaths. At the age of 73, Elena Ceaușescu became the only woman to be executed by firing squad in modern Romanian history. During her lifetime, she accumulated power, wealth, and influence, but she was remembered above all as a tyrant who did not hesitate to use brutality to maintain her grip on power. Her violent end symbolized the collapse of a regime defined by authoritarianism and repression, closing a dark chapter in Romanian history. Europe has endured countless totalitarian regimes, and the story of Helena and Nicolae Ceaușescu is just one example of their impact. But no discussion of brutal dictatorships would be complete without the Nazi regime and its final days. Have you ever wondered what life was like inside the famous Führer bunker during Hitler's last days? Who remained at his side? What was the atmosphere like in that underground hideout? These and other questions are answered in a special video we have prepared for you. If you are curious, click the video appearing on your screen to find out.